Hi, everybody. We have a really nice, intimate, friendly little gathering here. Thank you so much for coming to the Vancouver launch for the Jewish radical tradition. So nice to see you. So many familiar faces. It's lovely. I'm Shira Rose Walensky. I'm the board secretary here at the Parrott Center, and I'm on the coordinating committee for Independent Jewish Voices Vancouver. And it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. Thank you for coming again. Of course, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the unceded ancestral and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. These lands were never surrendered, and they remain under the ongoing stewardship of the peoples who have cared for them since time immemorial. This acknowledgement is not only about naming the past, but about understanding our responsibilities in the present. As Jews living on this land, our histories and ethical traditions call us to a moral obligation to pursue justice and collective liberation. That responsibility requires us to reckon with the realities of settler colonialism where we live and to take seriously our commitments to Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. It also calls us to oppose injustice carried out beyond these borders, including in Palestine, where ongoing genocide is being justified in our names. Grounded in a commitment to justice, dignity, and liberation, we must stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples here and in Palestine, and with all those resisting colonial violence worldwide. And it is in this spirit that we are here to celebrate the radical Jewish tradition by Donny Gluckstein and Janey Stone, who we are very lucky to have with us this evening. The book recovers a long, often suppressed history of Jewish resistance to oppression, highlighting working class and socialist Jews who forged solidarity with other oppressed groups and whose revived stories help us to imagine liberation as collective and interconnected. And I was just reminded this week by my dad that I'm a descendant of Joseph Salzberg, a Jewish labor organizer, longtime communist, and lifelong advocate for workers' rights and anti-racist legislation in Ontario. So, in light of that legacy, I am honored to introduce our speakers. Janey Stone's mother sought refuge in Australia from Polish anti-Semitism in the 1930s. Janey is a lifelong socialist and political activist. She has been a union delegate and participated in the student anti-Vietnam War and women's liberation movements. As an anti-Zionist Jew, she has written and presented about resistance to the Nazis in Germany and Poland and by Jews, and many other topics, including women workers, sexual politics, the Middle East, and the radical Jewish tradition. Janey is retired and lives in Melbourne, Australia. She has a leadership role in Interventions, Australia's only independent not-for-profit radical publishing company. Jess Goldman, whom we all know and love, is a writer, comic artist, and amateur puppeteer. Their writing has been published by Maisonneuve, CBC, and Room. Their short story, Tombstone of a Tzaddik, won the 2025 RBC Bronwyn Wallace Award for Emerging Writers. A graduate of the University of British Columbia's Creative Writing MFA program, their writing explores where Yiddishkeit and queer culture joyfully collide. So we are so lucky, so grateful to have Janey and Jess here this evening. So please join me in welcoming them.
Hi, Janey. Thank you so much for being here. We're extremely honored to have you here, especially in this place at the Parrott Center for Secular Yiddish Culture. As I was reading your book, I really felt like it's an ode to the spirit of this place and really honors, it's not about the Parrott Center, but I feel like it really honors the history that this place was built on and also the humanist principles that the Parrott Center was built on. So thank you so much for that. But yeah, tell me a bit about yourself. Did you grow up in the Jewish left, or did you come to that a bit later? I guess we heard a bit about that in the bio that was just read, but if you could elaborate, that would be amazing.
Right. So it is an honour for me too to be here. This is the first event of my book tour here in Canada. I only got here on Wednesday. And it is lovely to start out in a place like this that stands for the same thing that Donny and I stand for and were wanting to promote in writing the book. So, yes, I'm a red diaper baby. uh, both my parents were in the Communist Party in Melbourne, in Australia. And then later on, I was a student activist in the 60s, and then I spent 2 years living in the San Francisco Bay Area in 69 to 71, which was a really seminal period. The first women's liberation movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, Black Panthers, all of that, very important formation of my own politics. In the 1980s, I became more active as an anti-Zionist, and lots of time in between, lots of things happening. And I would say I am still active as a socialist and as a pro-Palestinian and anti-Zionist activist, but I do spend more time writing and speaking than being on demonstrations and meetings, which is what I used to do a lot. So I very much belong to the Jewish left. Well, the left, which includes a large number of Jews. But so I'm not like some people in the who've got a religious background. Both my parents were atheists. I have to say, I never fasted as a child. It was cultural Judaism. It was, the gefilte fish and the crab and so on that my mother represents, and of course nobody can make it like she used to. So my father's family, however, were extremely religious, but he broke from the religion at the age of 16, went into a restaurant and ate a steak and waited for the hand of God to strike him down. And when it didn't, he went off and joined the Communist Party. So probably, other people who've got a history similar to that. So I've always been a secular Jew, as are most of my Jewish friends.
Thank you. So considering that you've been a part of so many different movements in which there were Jewish and non-Jewish participants, what felt important to you and Donny about writing a book specifically about the history of the Jewish left? And I'm also wondering what that process of collaboration was like.
Right. So we started separately. We have separate backgrounds. Donny, for those of you who don't know, is British. He lives in Edinburgh. We met quite late in the story. So I started working on radical Jewish history topics about 10 years ago. And about then I wrote a chapter on Jewish resistance to the Nazis. Donny edited a book called Fighting on All Fronts about popular resistance in the Second World War. And I offered a topic of on Jewish resistance, which Donny found a bit embarrassing because he's Jewish himself, and he had a whole chapter list lined up which did not include that topic. So it ended up being a very successful chapter. And I continued to work on the subject because it became increasingly clear to me that the blurring of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism can lead some people who have not necessarily thought much about the subject, but if you're very pro-Palestine and anti-Zionist, and so other people say, well, that's the same thing as being anti-Semitic, some people can think, well, so be it. And I thought it was really important to show that there is a different way of being Jewish and a different way of being anti-Zionist. And that, in fact, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are two completely separate things. Now, Donny came to our book by a different route. His mother was born in South Africa, was a member of Hashemeh Hatzair, a Zionist, made Aliyah to Israel in wasn't yet Israel, it was Palestine, 41 or 1942, was on a very collectivist kibbutz and thought she was living socialist dream and she just loved it there until one day another young man at the kibbutz came up to her and said, hey, we're all going to go and stone the local Arab village next Saturday. Do you want to come with us? And that was the turning point for Tony's mother, Honey. names dropped out of my head. That's terrible. Anyway, that was a turning point for her, and she went on to end up being with um, Gluckstein, who's better known as Tony Cliff, and Donny came along the scene. So she became an anti-Zionist at that point. So there's two different stories there. After Honey died, Honey Rosenberg, after Honey died, Donny approached me and suggested we had commonalities on the subject and suggested we collaborate on a book. And we wrote the book on the basis that we had an approach that we hadn't seen anywhere else. We hadn't seen any book that had brought all this together. There is individual descriptions, information on individual topics, but somebody that brings it together and shows there's a whole tradition, not just this event here and that event over there. So I just would like to do a short reading from the book where I want to say a little bit out of the introduction, which is actually partly where the name comes from. So this is a slightly abbreviated text from the book. So the lost world of Jewish life in interwar Poland is very often invoked with nostalgia. You get the romanticized image of the shtetl focusing on food, family warmth, and traditional customs. But there's another side to the story. And an Australian activist, a man called Arnold Zabel, he describes his father's memories of Warsaw's political life this way. Warsaw whirls into a frenzy of activity as the hub, the headquarters of political movements, left, right, and indifferent. Buddhists, Zionists, assimilationists, the Orthodox and free thinkers fought each other for communal control and allegiance. Circles of aspiring artists and writers gathered in cafes and meeting rooms to argue, to exchange ideas. And when Arnold visited Poland to meet the people of his parents' generation, he wrote this: stories survived, countless tales of partisans and revolutionaries, resistance fighters and firebrands engaged in a fiery struggle. So that's where the subtitle of our book comes from.
So much of what you just said, and so much of the book, it's such a formidable book, and it's really impressive the amount of history that you've been able to pack in there. But so much of the book that really blew me away is just the way in which you explode sort of like myth after myth, about anti-Semitism, about Zionism, about the Holocaust. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about the way in which historiographical myth dominates so many of our accounts of Jewish history.
Yes, so as you say, there are plenty of myths around, but one of the core ones that we built this book around, and we mention it almost on, I think it's actually the first page, it's page 7, is what's called, one writer called the lachrymose conception of Jewish history. Well, lachrymose is just a fancy word for tearful, the tearful conception of Jewish history. And that's the idea that Jews are the eternal victims. And this has been weaponized by Zionists to claim Israel is always the victim. Jews are always victims. Israel is Jewish, therefore Israel is always the victim. And one of the things we've tried to do in this book is to show that Jews fought back. And it's chock full of stories about Jews engaged in struggles against anti-Semitism and against their exploitation as workers. And they didn't do this as Zionists. They did it as radicals and socialists of all kinds. So that's the first myth. And then you get the one where Zionists claim to represent Jews historically. Well, it's a complete lie. It's just an outright lie. Because Zionists were mostly only a very small minority prior to 1948. And, for example, during the period of mass migration, escaping from the pogroms at the end of the 19th century and before World War I, where did everybody go? Well, did they head to Palestine? Something like 1 in 17 went to Palestine. And all the rest, well, first of all, most of them probably wanted to go to the US, failing that, Canada. But they also went to Argentina, Australia. and so on. They did not choose the Zionist utopia. So the next myth is the one that Zionists claim to be the ones fighting anti-Semitism. Well, historically, if you look at most of the struggles against anti-Semitism, it was socialists and radicals who were the ones fighting, not the rabbis in the synagogues, not the mainstream self-appointed Jewish community leaders, all of that. It was people like us, wasn't it? And in fact, Zionism was never about saving Jews or solving anti-Semitism or even really opposing it. In fact, up till 1948, I just 2 days ago read a really great summary of this subject. If you applied to go to Palestine, make Aliyah, you got rejected unless you were young, healthy, and wealthy, because they wanted pioneers and they wanted people to build up their country. And there's long lists of people that they would reject: poor people, rape victims, people with mental health problems, people with illnesses, old people. So, and even after 1948, they continued for at least the next 10 years to be highly selective. So the last myth is the whole thing about Jewish indigeneity. I mean, Jews just aren't a homogeneous group genetically. And in fact, of course, as we know, race does not exist. It is not a biological fact. Judaism was a religion for most of the 2,000 years. Jewish culture and history are very diverse. But most importantly, the whole concept of Jews being in some way a racial or indigenous group is furthering the 19th century approach of treating Jews as a race. That is biological determinism.
Okay. Yeah, this phenomenon of Jews as a race in the 19th century, I'm wondering if you can sort of elaborate on the history of the concepts of Jewish hatred or Jew hatred, how different forms of anti-Semitism developed over history and turned into what we now know as modern anti-Semitism, and if you could talk particularly about how this changed in the 19th century and how Jews became to be considered a race. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, it's not like hatred of Jews was invented modern. We know that historically, in many places and many times, although not everywhere and always, but there have been very bad periods where Jews have been oppressed and Jews have been hated. But this was directed against Jews as a religion. And also because of their religion, Jews were often confined to very restricted economic roles. So some of the hatred derived from the specific economic roles as moneylenders and so on that Jews were forced to play. But during the late 19th century, this all changed. And it's not an accident that it was at the period of the growth of imperialism and the establishment of modern nation states, that is, the growth of modern nationalism. So the thing is that imperialism requires justification for the subjection of the colonialized people. And so they developed this pseudo-scientific concept of race and racial hierarchy. If you're going to expropriate people, it's very convenient to redefine them as subhumans or even non-humans, as some type of animal. And then that justifies you taking over their country, their land, and enslaving them and so on. So it's in that context that the modern form of Jew hatred came into being. And modern anti-Semitism is based on a racial concept of Jews, a biological concept, instead of religious. And so modern anti-Semitism is a form of racism. Now, one example I like to give is that Marx, who was born in the early 19th century, Marx's father was baptized. So Marx was born not Jewish. When Marx was born, he wasn't Jewish in the early 19th century. But by the late 19th century, his daughter, Eleanor Marx, could get up and say, my father was a Jew. So he went from being not Jewish to being Jewish. but not because of anything he did, but because of the change in the understanding of what being a Jew was, and therefore the understanding of what anti-Semitism was. So I've got quite a long answer to this question.
It's important.
We can hold it together. So the thing is, the word anti-Semitism was actually an invention from this period by a German called Wilhelm Marr, and he actually established an organisation called the League of Anti-Semites, and he was actually arguing for being anti-Semitic. So he actually invented this word because he hated Jews so much that he said, right, all Germans should think the same as we do, and you should all become anti-Semites. So his position was based on that concept that Jews, it's a biological concept that Jews are born that way and remain the objects of hatred and oppression, and therefore are handy as scapegoats. So if it's okay with you, I'm just going to read a little bit on this subject out of the book because it expresses it better than I can off the top of my head. So Marr introduced the term anti-Semitism in his awkwardly titled book, The Victory of Judaism over Germanism Viewed from a Non-Denominational Point of View. That was the title of his book in German, so it was twice as long. Non-denominational meant basing hatred on race rather than religion, and was a significant departure from the feudal approach because conversion to Christianity was no longer an escape. And the opening chapter of this book states, without exception, from the very beginning, the Jews were hated by all peoples. End of quote. This sounds remarkably like something we've heard from Zionists. Throughout their history, Jews have regarded Jew hatred as an inevitable consequence of their Jewishness. So the converse was true. Renewed targeting in 1879 had nothing to do with long-term factors, but current capitalist needs. Shapira explains how the new anti-Semitism functioned in Germany's context of high assimilation. Quote, the old hatred of Jews had been aimed at the alien, different Jew, whereas anti-Semitism targeted the Jew who looked like anyone else, who spoke the local language, whose appearance and behaviour was middle class, who took part in and even created national culture, which was what the Jews in Germany were like, and in Austria, they were part of that culture. So whether a Jew was a devout or atheist, was devout or an atheist, orthodox or assimilationist, left-wing or conservative, lumping them together as a racial enemy provided a new catch-all means of distracting from social and class realities. The racial stereotype applied to Jews drew on remote history to seemingly make sense of the modern era with its focus on money. Contemporary non-denominational capitalism was masking its negative impact on society. Anti-Semitism was a novel fabrication for several reasons. Firstly, the very word had a racist fiction as its foundation. And that has to do with the use of the word Semite, which in fact is a language group and not a human genetic group. Secondly, its racial wrapping combined successive layers of Jew hatred. Under feudalism, Jews were portrayed as a religious foe. Later, the rising bourgeoisie saw them as competitors to be pushed aside, and so Jews were cast as an economic foe. This was now supplemented with the Jew as the political foe of capitalism itself. Thirdly, anti-Semitism was facilitated by a ruling class in the most advanced and culturally integrated European country using science as justification. And the philosopher Eugen Dühring claimed hatred of Jews was a natural judgment based on natural grounds. And finally, workers were not fooled because their experience of direct exploitation pointed to the real cause of social misery. So the movement turned to wooing the middle class instead. And this was a variation on the method of divide and rule, but achieved the original purpose because it set subordinate classes against each other.
Thank you. I know you said that answer was long, and it was, but it's really important because I think it really highlights the way in which anti-Semitism is used as a counter-revolutionary tactic. And I think on the left as a whole, it's kind of important that we understand it through that lens. And I think your answer really, really brings light to that and sort of gets into the nitty-gritty. But you spoke of workers at the end there, and speaking of workers and the ruling class's attempt at divide and rule through the use of political anti-Semitism, let's turn to the Bund. Many of you know Molly Crabapple's new book about the Bund, and that's done a lot to bring the Bund into like the mainstream, into the more public eye. But your book also talks extensively about the Bund, so let's like dig into some of the topics that you cover. So first off, can you give us some more details on the context in which the Jewish Labor Bund emerged, and also its particular combination of revolutionary and reformist politics?
Yes, so it's funny this timing because of Molly Crabapple's book having just come out, and I actually have a copy of it, but it's sitting in my living room at home unread because I didn't want to lug books on this trip, which is a great pity. So everybody else will have read it before I do. But yes, we've written our own much shorter history of the Bund. And so just briefly, probably most of you know most of this already, but the Bund was a major revolutionary organisation in the Tsarist Empire from its formation in 1897. And it was larger than other non-Jewish revolutionary organisations, something like, was it 30,000 members, and at the first Congress of the RSD, Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, something like 30,000, the Bund had 30,000 members at that time, and all the other parties combined was something like 8,000. So that's how important the Bund was as a revolutionary organisation in those early days. And I think and they were the first to turn from just study circles to agitation and to start establishing trade unionism among the urban Jewish working class. And the thing is that the Bund had a number of contradictory ideas to certain elements of nationalism. They were revolutionary, and later on they changed their direction. They were more reformist and so on. But I think what kept the Bund, despite the contradictory ideas in some of the people's head, what kept them on the straight and narrow was Doigkeit. And unfortunately, there's no English word for this, and I wish there was, because it would be so much easier to make some arguments to non-Jews as to what you have to do. The central key thing, if you're going to be an activist, is the struggle in the here and now. What's the crucial issues for us here today? And that's what kept them in the straight and narrow. You can have contradictory ideas in your head, but if you can say, right, we have to oppose genocide here and now, it helps show you the way forward. So, of course, that was one of the consequences of that Doigkeit. They were fighting anti-Semitism, but because they wanted to struggle here rather than go somewhere else, they were anti-Zionist. So the Bund played a major role in the 1905 revolution. Before that date, something like a third of all prisoners in Siberia were Jews, and not only Bund, but I think they must have been overwhelmingly Bundists. The Bund threw themselves into the 1905 revolution, and disproportionately more Jews were arrested than everybody else. And following the revolution, the Tsarist regime unleashed a massive wave of pogroms, and the Bund was devastated, decimated, shrunk in size, and became less important numerically. In the 1917 revolution, they split in several different directions. Some people went with the Bolsheviks, some didn't. And then Poland became an independent country, and a number of members of the Bund regrouped in Poland. Now, this version, Bund Mark II, I suppose, was no longer considered themselves to be revolutionary. They were members of the Second International. They were very anti-communist. They actually used to have horrible fights with the communists. But the thing is, their Doigkeit still kept them on the straight and narrow, opposing anti-Semitism, organising workers, and so on. And so they remained very active among the working class and true to that core concept. And they also remained committed anti-Zionists. So I'm not going to go into the current period, but there's your summary, my summary of the Bund in the pre-1948 period.
Thank you. Can you elaborate a bit on the Bundist defense leagues and how exactly did they run their defense and from what were they defending Jewish communities?
So the thing is, when I started researching this history, it was actually one of my first discoveries was the fact that Jews had actually fought back against pogroms when in Tsarist Russia. You know, before that, the main image you get, if you just look up, I don't know, some sort of website with a bit of Jewish history, the main image you get is how terrible pogroms were, which obviously were, and you get this image of frightened Jews huddling in the shuls. And that's what you hear. And I was amazed. I had never heard that there was self-defense, and I was really surprised about it. And that was primarily set up by the Bund, but also with other socialists and leftists involved, so other Jews and non-Jews. And they first set up their self-defense after a pogrom in Kishinev in 1903. And these self-defense groups were led by the Bund, but as I said, they were in coalition with others because they didn't just see the issue of self-defense as just being about Jews. What they said was that the struggle against anti-Semitism was also directed against the ruling class and for socialism, and thus the two struggles were one. This is such a characteristic Bund thing to say. And so even though they weren't able to successfully defend Jews every time, there really were some successes which were completely new to me. For instance, in 1906 in Bialystok, they were able to completely protect the major working class sections of the city. And I've got this lovely quote. At every corner of the poor section of Bialystok, patrols of the Jewish Self-Defense League were stationed with revolvers and grenades. They guarded the streets and fired warning shots into the air. If a Gentile went by carrying loot, they would frighten him until he threw down the stolen package and fled. So that's such a different picture to people huddling and cowering in the shul. And I was just so pleased to discover this history. So then when you go into interwar Poland in the 1930s, there was a period, again, of rising anti-Semitism, and particularly after Pilsudski died in 1936, there was fascists roaming the streets, attacking people, beating them up and so on. And again, there was a need for self-defense groups. And so they had this I've got this quote from the Bund from the time. Today, the Jewish working class is saying to the fascist and anti-Semitic hoodlums, the time has passed when Jews could be subject to pogroms with impunity. There exists a mass of workers raised in the Bund tradition of struggle and self-defense. Pogroms will not remain unpunished. Isn't that a wonderful, defiant stand?
It's incredible.
So the Bund didn't want the confrontations to be between Poles and Jews, but between fascists and anti-fascists. So they deliberately drew in non-Jewish workers. And the Bund and the Socialist Party the Polish Socialist Party collaborated very closely. Every year they collaborated over May Day parades. Actually, one year the PSP offered the Bund that the Bund militia would defend the Polish Socialist Party, and the Polish Socialist Party militia would defend the Jewish contingent, which was a most fantastic offer, which unfortunately the Bund declined, which I'm not going to go into the reason for that. But it shows you how closely they were able to work together. So they had May Day parades, and there was general strikes against the pogroms and anti-Semitic attacks, which is also something I had never heard of until I started my research. So the habit of cooperation built up over many years meant that when the Nazis invaded in 1939, thousands of Jews found, at least initially, a hiding place in the flats of non-Jewish workers.
Oof. Yeah, this history is so incredible. I mean, for so many reasons. So much is going through my head. Like, one, talking about the Bundesdefense Leagues, I feel like it just gives us a way to also look at Palestinian resistance in this moment. And on top of that, just the intercommunal solidarity that you talk about between Jewish workers and non-Jewish workers, and how clear, like you said, the Bund was on that alliance, and how they were fighting for the same liberation. So yeah. Speaking about solidarity, that's a huge theme of the book. And I think for me, the most moving parts of the book were about that solidarity. And you see often how this solidarity and labor struggles lead also to solidarity and struggles in other spheres of life, to struggle for better conditions, both in the public sphere and the private sphere. And women in particular really feature in that. So I'm wondering if you can talk about the role of women in the meat strikes and the rent strikes in London and New York in particular. Yeah.
Yes, so, throughout this book, there really is a particular focus on women. And that's not because I said, right, we've got to include women, we're women's liberation. It's just because it happens because the women actually do surge into the forefront. So over and over again, when you look at important movements, you find not just one or two women in the leading roles, but you find repeatedly in these mass movements, masses of women newly moving into struggle. And I've got two examples. One, there's so many stories from New York, and it had to be so selective. But I just found the New York stories particularly fascinating. And because New York, of course, was the major destination of Jews fleeing from the pogroms in Russia. And when they got to New York, the streets actually weren't lined with gold, which does not surprise us, but obviously surprised a lot of people. And they had to end up living in indescribable conditions with very unstable or no work at all. So you end up with the almost continuous struggle in the Jewish areas of New York from the late 19th century until World War II. So in the early period, there was, in the late 19th century, there was strike after strike by all these little groups, cap makers and umbrella makers, the way the economy worked at that time in the workforce. And they all had their separate strikes to establish trade unions. Socialists played a major role in this. Now, there's one of the interesting things is how the struggle moved backwards and forwards between the workplace and the community. The story I'm going to tell you now is one of my main favourites from the book. And it's about how in May 1902, there was an increase in the retail price of kosher meat. And the housewives got outraged by this. And a crowd of 20,000 women just came together and set off down the street. The newspaper reported it this way. An excitable and aroused crowd, mostly of women, roamed the streets, armed with sticks, vocabularies, and well-sharpened nails. The police attacked, but they didn't have it all their own way. One woman retaliated by slapping a cop in the face with a moist piece of liver.
Yes.
Yes. When the issue spread to Brooklyn, the New York Times had this headline: Brooklyn mob loots butcher shops. Rioters led by women wreck a dozen stores, dance around bonfires of oil-drenched meat piled in the street. Fierce fight with police. And then that was the headline. Then the story goes on. The mob ran through the street, howling in their peculiar Russian and Polish dialects, wrecking with stones and other missiles every butcher's shop in their path. When the police arrived, women threw bottles, stones, and whatever they could place their hands on. Women shook their fists in their faces and tore off their shields and buttons from their coats. There was a charge on the mob, and nightsticks were used freely. And the New York Times ended by calling for the repression of this, quote, dangerous class especially the women who are very ignorant. So, and then when a magistrate asked one woman why they were rioting, she replied, "We don't riot, but if all we did was to weep at home, nobody would notice it." So this was then followed, this kosher meat strike was followed by a series of rent strikes, again led by women and supported by socialists. And then the community action fed back into the workplace in 1908 with, probably most of you have heard about the uprising of the 20,000. This is something I learned about when I lived in the States. Nobody in Australia has ever heard of it, but it's one of the classic Labor history stories. I imagine most of you know about this. But the thing is that it wasn't just that's the classic story, but there was masses of strikes in the whole clothing trade from that period right through to the war to 1914. So leading up to this 1908 strike, socialists called a large parade. And the demonstration was so successful that German socialist Clarence Zetkin proposed an International Working Women's Day in 1910, which has continued ever since. So it's worth remembering the real heritage of IWD, International Women's Day. And the real heritage isn't feminism as some sort of separate category, but a history that is Jewish, socialist, and working class, in which women play a leading role. So that's my New York story. So now I've got my second story about rent strikes in London, which is another subject I actually didn't know about till I did this research. So again, it was overwhelmingly led by women, and this was in the late 1930s. And in the families all came together, set up these committees, and so on, and went on rent strike. And it was overwhelmingly the women who did the picketing, the women who often dominated the committees, and the women who came out on demonstrations. And I have a quote from the time: "Outstanding were the women. There was nothing that the men could do that could not be equaled by the women. And in fact, they were mostly more enthusiastic and healthy and hence more reliable." So a bit again out of the book. During rent strikes, the tenants put up barricades and barbed wire around the buildings, and guards patrolled the entrances. And even the milkmen and postmen had to get permits to enter. When police attacked, women would drop mouldy flour and water from above and fight them with sticks and shovels and saucepans. And so one of the participants just said this at the time, and I think this is so important. Quote, "It was a genuine united movement of the people, drawing together Jews and Christians at a time when anti-Semitic propaganda was being stepped up, helping to isolate and expose both fascists and right-wing local Labor leaders." And I just there's a little example they give of how this worked, how this mutual support between the Jews and non-Jews worked, and keeping in mind the main activists are women. In one of the buildings, there was a mixture of Jewish and non-Jewish families. The picketers, all women who were also responsible for the daily shopping, had a novel way of carrying out both responsibilities. Without any hesitation and with lots of fun, Mrs. Smith would go to the Jewish butcher shop to buy meat for Mrs. Cohen on the picket line. And the next day, Mrs. Cohen, who would never have thought of doing this in all her life, would go to buy meat at the local general butcher for Mrs. Smith. Isn't that a wonderful story?
It's so amazing. Yeah, and I think really highlights the need for intercommunal solidarity and for building solidarity across marginalized groups. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how building solidarity across groups now is like not only important for this current moment, but for future liberation struggles, and sort of the importance about thinking about movement work in a longer timeline.
Right. So I'm actually going to phrase my answer a little bit differently.
Sure.
So I'd argue that the important thing to understand is that the only way the working class can make gains in the long run is collectively. And it's this that lays the basis for solidarity. It's not just people deciding, which is lovely. It's not just people deciding, I'm going to be an ally, I'm going to show solidarity. It's actually based in combined interests, united interests. And when people experience such solidarity, there's a new dynamic which takes the historical prejudices and produces a new consciousness. People are changed. And I want to give the example from the mass demonstration against the British Union of Fascists and Oswald Mosley in Cable Street in London's East End in 1936. Now, everyone here knows about the uprising of the 20,000, but probably a lot of people have not heard about Cable Street, whereas it's the opposite in the UK. Everybody knows about Cable Street, but people haven't heard about the American examples, which is what we're doing, is bringing these different stories together. Have people here heard about Cable Street? Would you put your hands up? Just so I have to get a sense. So, yeah, not everybody, some people have. So the thing is, there are many accounts of this event, but usually what you do is you get started with the day they decided to have the demonstration and go through till the end of it. But in fact, the roots go back much earlier. Because one of my ideas in writing this book was to show that nothing comes out of the blue. You get a mass demonstration of hundreds of thousands of people. That's years of work, of small demonstrations, little meetings and so on. I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about here. So this story goes back decades earlier, and it goes back into the late 19th century when Jewish workers in the East End were struggling against the sweating system and against their appalling working and living conditions. So in 1889, Jewish tailors went on strike, and among other support, they received a large donation from dockers. Now, this is in despite of the fact that dockers were Catholics and often anti-Semitic. One of the main leaders was a known anti-Semite, and yet they donated to this important strike among Jewish tailors. So then in 1912, 20 approximately years later, less than that, 15, there was a major dock strike, and it nearly foundered because the strikers were running out of money and had trouble supporting their families. So Jewish families took in the children of the dockers and so looked after them and fed them, enabling the dockers to stay out on strike. So this was a wonderful return. And then 24 years later, again in 1936, the dockers again returned the favour and constituted the militant vanguard at Cable Street. And I just love this story of this to and fro exchange and support and mutual solidarity in spite of anti-Semitism and in spite of prejudice. So one of the participants, a man called Bill Fishman, described it this way. I was moved to tears to see bearded Jews and Irish Catholic dockers standing up to stop Mosley. I shall never forget it as long as I live, how working class people could get together to oppose the evil of fascism. And another participant, a woman called Alice Hitchin, she said this, there were so many of us you couldn't move. I can remember the elation in the crowd that so many people were there. The dockers came from Limehouse and Poplar, to my amazement, because they had a reputation for being anti-Semitic. There were cabinet makers from Bethnal Green and tailors from Whitechapel. There were so many different accents. Miners came from Wales and communists from all over Britain. They shall not pass was on everybody's lips. And then you go on to the descriptions of the feeling after the event. And in some ways, these are more important to me than the descriptions of the conflict between the demonstrators and the police, because they show how transformative an experience like this can be. The anti-fascists celebrated with an impromptu march in the streets and partied in the pubs until early morning. Participants reveal a level of euphoria over much more than the achievement of the immediate goals. A man called Max Levitas. You should have been there to hear the cry and see people jumping and shouting in joy. People who had never drunk beer in their lives drank a glass of beer. We had one. Alice Hitchin again. Everyone was cheering. Where I was, people were dancing and singing and throwing their arms around one another. And Bill Fishman again. There were parties, there was dancing in the streets. The cafes were full, the pubs were full, and there was a feeling of elation, a feeling of relief, particularly among the immigrant Jews. This jubilation has remained within the memory of the labour movement to this day, 85 years later. 90 years now, it was 85 when we wrote the book. This is the anniversary this year. The intense feeling derived from the creation, even for a short time, of a radical, united movement of the working class in its broadest sense, together with its allies. The people present could feel the possibilities and strength that unity brings, and that feeling has been passed on to later generations.
Thank you. Yeah, it's this part of the book, when I read it, was one of the most memorable. I think in the book you also mention, I mean, similar to the last line you just read, but this idea of sort of Cable Street being so alive in the living memory of people, and the fact that that memory could be passed on through the generations in such a powerful way that the next generation actually showed up to defend the Jewish working class neighborhood when Mosley and his British fascists tried to walk through it. So I mean, yeah, just really, I think, at least for me, I think many of us in this room think on very long timelines, but for me, it really sort of displaced this. I think like the urgency we can sometimes feel in moments of where we're seeing violence happen all around us. For me, it kind of made me realize, whoa, like there's a different way to think about the way that we do things, and sort of the timelines that we're going for in terms of winning struggles. So I think that's so important. I just continuing on with this theme of solidarity, I was wondering if you could also speak to Black Jewish solidarity in the U.S. Communist Party in the 1930s.
This is one of the most, every part of the book was I keep saying this is fascinating and that is fascinating, but somebody drew my attention to this topic, and I really think it has so many implications. And it's a little known topic. Now, I have to say I'm not an expert, and I did get most of my information from one study of the subject, but I still think it's worth talking about. Now, the US Communist Party made the fight against white chauvinism a central plank of party policy in 1930. And it's very interesting that they treated the subject as not just externally oriented, placing demands on society and so on, but they also addressed internal party life. They tried to create an interracial community. And the younger generation of party activists, again, very interestingly, took the whole idea up very enthusiastically. And even though there were many ethnic groups in the way the Communist Party was structured still in 1930, it appears that Jews really played a particularly important and major role, particularly in New York. And the impact of this campaign was particularly evident in Harlem. So one example is the Scottsboro struggle, which again I assume most of you have heard about the 9 black boys and young men in Alabama who were accused of raping 2 white women. Probably most of you have heard about that. So Jews were central participants in the struggle and provided the shock troops for Harlem protests around the issue. And there's another very interesting example in a different angle, and this is about a man called Abel Meeropol, whose parents were Russian Jewish immigrants. And he grew up in the Bronx and became a communist and a teacher union activist. James Baldwin, interestingly, was one of his students. So in 1937, there was a wave of lynchings of black people in the South, and Meeropol published a poem in the Teachers Union magazine, and later on he set it to music. And this song became Billie Holiday's signature number, Strange Fruit, which all of you will be familiar with. And I personally find it so moving that this famous black song sung by Billie Holiday was written by a Jewish communist trade union worker. I just find that unbelievable myself. So there's a lot more about, to say about this Black Jewish Alliance, but I just want to end up on this topic by quoting the well-known Black leader Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And he wrote this in 1945. He wrote that Jewish participation in radical causes had helped counter anti-Semitic agitation of some Black nationalists. Quote, the Scottsboro case was the first successful reputation of the anti-Semitic propaganda with which the Negro has been bombarded.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that just highlights what you said before about allyship and sort of it's not about being like, oh, I'm going to be an ally and be in solidarity with somebody, but it's mutual, like you said, combined interests and stakes in something. Okay, so we're almost at the end, but before I get to the last heavier question, I was wondering if you could tell us your favorite story.
Right. I mean, I do like the moist piece of liver. It's one of my favorite
Yeah, we're going to be bringing that to future protests.
But I have another story here that I think this audience will appreciate. In the London's East End in the 1880s and 1890s, the prominent radical current were anarchists. And they're actually led by a man called Rudolf Rocker, who was actually not Jewish, but he moved to the London East End and learnt Yiddish and became a leader of the Jewish East End workers and the anarchists there. So the anarchists were very heavily into disputing religion and promoting atheism. And they were also not exactly polite, and they were heavily into action, speaking louder than words. And so they used to take, and if you could realise that in the 19th century, atheism was an important topic. It was virtually illegal to be an atheist and to advocate for atheism. So it's a different circumstance to today. So one of the things these anarchists used to do was to go and eat ham sandwiches in front of the shul on Yom Kippur. Which I found pretty, well, sectarian. I'm not saying they should have done it, but it's pretty hilarious. But the other thing is that it's amusing. They set up this club where everybody used to come, in the days where people obviously didn't have TV and what have you. People went out to social clubs and all different, you could get food and there was, reading groups and libraries and concerts and dances and all the rest of that. We had one like that in Melbourne. That's where my parents met, a place like that. Anyway, the anarchists had this club and they used to have food there. So the thing is that also on Yom Kippur, some of the people who'd just been in the shul used to sneak in to this anarchist Jewish club to have something to eat, which was also quite an interesting event. Anyway, they used to have a lot of lectures in this club, and atheism was I'm reading from the book now, it was a popular lecture topic, and speakers on such topics as the absurdity of religion and is there a God drew substantial audiences. On one occasion, the speaker took out his watch and declaimed, if there is a God, I give him just 2 minutes' time to kill me on the spot. And you can just see him standing there like that. After a tense wait, with the speaker still alive, a thunder of applause echoed through the hall. The band struck up the Marseillaise, which was regarded as the most revolutionary anthem, and the audience all joined in the Yom Kippur ball.
So incredible. I'm like, I feel like the Parrott Center is slowly turning into this kind of vibe. But the Yom Kippur balls, that's something you talk about a lot in there. And have folks heard of those happening? So basically there were these, atheist, anarchist balls, and people would dress up. What were their costumes? Do you know? Like,
I don't know.
Oh God, we have to find out. But I think that we should have one here.
I think you should too.
That'd be amazing. Thank you for that story. It's so inspiring, especially to me because my sphere is more the cultural side of things. So I'm really fascinated in any story about the sort of like entertainment that socialists and anarchists and communists at that time sort of took in to fuel the more serious work, shall we say. Okay, last question. We're going to pivot back to Eastern Europe for this question. So, of course, as the rise of fascism is happening today globally, the Holocaust and the Nazis are a really hot topic, if we can call it that. But this history is really important because you talk a lot about the history of struggle against fascists and the Nazis. And I was in this book, especially near the end. And I was wondering if you can talk about the history of struggle, anti-fascist struggle between Jews and non-Jews, and specifically Jews and Poles, in terms of getting resources to the resistance fighters in the ghettos and also in the forests. And I wanted you to talk specifically too about the ghetto girls.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so this topic brings us to the worst of the myth of Jews as passive victims. You know, we've all heard it, that Jews went to the concentration camps like lambs to the slaughter. And I don't know how many people here actually realise that there were underground resistance movements in approximately 100 ghettos and actually armed uprisings in 50 of them. And there were also uprisings in 21 concentration camps and Jewish partisans in approximately 50 partisan groups. In addition to that, about 10,000 people survived in family camps in the forest. So there is, just on the numbers, you can see there was a larger scale of resistance than people are usually aware of. And then there was a lot of small actions that don't come into the numbers like that. So the forced labourers used to carry out sabotage. So they might be working in a shoe factory and they put nails into the boots. And tailors sewed left arms into the right arms of the uniforms and vice versa. All sorts of small-scale sabotage. And one of the stories that I found hard to believe, but it is absolutely amazing, forced labourers in Bialystok on May Day in 1942 recognised May Day and commemorated it. They couldn't strike, but they stood by the machines as long as there was no guards nearby. When the guards came by, they pretended to work, and then they stopped work again when the guards went off. Wow. So in terms of solidarity between Jews and Poles, one very important example is the United Underground Organisation in Minsk, which had a culture of solidarity between Jews and non-Jews. So it was one underground organisation. In most cities, there was one for the Jews and one for non-Jews, but in Minsk it was combined. And they did all sorts of activities. They had a clandestine press, they smuggled children out of the ghetto, and they helped 10,000 people to escape into the forest. And most of these people survived the war. Now, the book that I have a whole, that's one paragraph, and I've got a whole book on the subject. But the thing is, the woman who wrote this book made a very interesting point. She said that the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, important though it is, gets a whole lot of attention, whereas what happened in Minsk is in many ways at least as important, if not more important. It doesn't have the drama of an uprising, but they're actually more successful in saving people. And she blames the Zionists for this disproportionate attention, which I think is really interesting. And then there's all sorts of small events and incidents that you have to find them where you find them that you wouldn't know about. And I've got a really astonishing story that happened in a town in Poland in the autumn of 1942. So the Nazis had come along and had ordered all the Jews, they were going to carry out a massacre. They ordered all the Jews to gather together and undress while they stood over them brandishing whips and sticks, and tore the clothes off the women. We've heard of stories of like that happening. Suddenly, the naked women reacted. They attacked the officers, scratching and biting and throwing stones, and the panicked Nazis ran off. Isn't that an astonishing story? Now, on the question of support and solidarity, there was the Polish organisation Zegota, it was called in Polish, the Council to Aid Jews. And they helped about half of the Polish Jews who survived the war. Most of its members were socialists who had already started fighting anti-Semitism before the war in that period in interwar Poland that I was talking about. And the best-known Zegota activist is Irene Sendler, who saved 2,500 Jewish children by smuggling them out of the Warsaw Ghetto. And you have to keep in mind that the Poles doing that will risk death penalty. It's often their family and collective punishment as well. So there's so many more stories I could tell you, but if I told you all of them, you wouldn't buy the book. So I want to end with just one more story, and that's the story of the women couriers, sometimes called ghetto girls, who travelled between the ghettos and between the communities, maintaining communications. Now, the majority of these couriers were women, and I think with this audience, well, understand why. It's because of the pants drop test. Do I have to explain that to this audience? You know why. Anybody who does it, I'm happy to explain.
Circumcision.
The only time I've ever had to not explain it, I tell you, usually you have to explain why. So the couriers smuggled people, cash, fake IDs, underground publications, information and weapons. They hid items in their clothes, their bras, in sanitary towels, in their shoes, in sacks of potatoes. They smuggled guns in loaves of bread and coded messages in their plaited hair. So most of these women were members of Jewish socialist youth groups or communists, and their stories are full of the kind of material that usually makes it into film and notoriety, yet they are virtually unknown. So my last story from the book is about a communist, Jutta Teitelbaum, who was blonde and blue-eyed and looked like a naive young Polish teenager. But she was an assassin. And she used to walk openly into the offices or homes of Gestapo officers and shoot them in cold blood. And one day she strolled up to the guards outside a Gestapo prison and feigned shame and whispered that she needed to speak to a certain officer about a personal matter. The guards assumed that she was pregnant and they politely showed her the way. Once in the officer's room, she pulled out a concealed pistol with a silencer and shot him. And on the way out, she smiled meekly at the guards who'd let her in. The couriers endured prison, rape, humiliation and beatings and kept on fighting. And the astonishing bravery, intelligence, resourcefulness, drive and determination and self-sacrifice of these women fully destroys the myth that Jews went as sheep to the slaughter. So I hope you see now why our book is subtitled Revolutionaries, Resistance Fighters and Firebrands. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow.